What if everything you've ever been told about the family of Jesus was incomplete? What if the bloodline of Christ didn't end at the cross, but continued hidden through daughters whose names were struck from every gospel, every record, every tombstone? For nearly 2,000 years, the Church has maintained that Jesus was celibate, that he had no wife, no children. But buried under centuries of silence scattered across forgotten texts, outlawed scrolls, and stained glass whispers is a far more radical story. One that hints at an erased lineage, a feminine inheritance, a daughter, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a child of Christ. And if this is true, then the implications stretch far beyond theology into politics, power, and the deliberate rewriting of history itself. So you close your eyes, let the candlelight flicker across your imagination, and step quietly into a different version of the past. The air is heavy with frankincense and silence. You're walking not through a cathedral, but through time, down corridors of vanished manuscripts, over marble floors polished by forgotten feet. You begin to notice the absences. The women who were there then weren't. The sudden gaps in genealogies. The too clean endings. You remember how stories are shaped not just by what is told, but by what is left out. There's a name no one dares speak. A child never pictured in stained glass. A birth not recorded except perhaps in the margins of the forbidden books. This is the story of the hidden daughters of Christ and the Church that tried to erase them. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You begin by turning the pages slowly, as though the ink might smudge beneath your eyes. The four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are familiar territory. You've heard their stories in churches, on dusty tapestries, and in Sunday school whispers. But when you really look, when you read, as if searching for something lost, you notice the women. Or rather, you notice how little they are allowed to speak. Mary, his mother, appears briefly in childhood scenes and vanishes again until the crucifixion. Other Marys drift in and out like ghosts, Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, but always at the edge of the frame. There are other women too, Joanna, Susanna, the daughters of Jerusalem. Their names flicker by like candlelight in a hallway of locked doors. They fund his ministry. They stand by his side when the men run. They're the first to witness the empty tomb. And yet when the resurrection is proclaimed, it is Peter who speaks. It is Paul who writes. It is the women who are forgotten. And not one word, not one syllable tells you if Jesus ever fathered children. That absence is louder than silence. It feels deliberate, as if something has been gently lifted out of the story, tucked away before it could be questioned. In a culture where lineage defined identity, and where sons and daughters carried legacies and land rights, how could the most influential rabbi of his generation, hailed as Messiah by many, not have left behind a family? The defenders of orthodoxy argue it was holiness, a divine calling that transcended marriage and blood, but others whisper something different, that the women closest to him, those erased by the stroke of ecclesiastical quills, weren't omitted because they were unimportant, but because they were too important. That among those women might have been a partner, and from that union a child, or more than one. There's a detail you can't unsee once it's noticed. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is told that his mother and brothers are outside, he replies, "My mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it." A spiritual family, yes. But is that answer a redirection or a redaction? Did the original story include more names, relationships, a daughter's cry behind the curtain? Historians point out that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death, compiled in communities already contending with Roman persecution, doctrinal conflict, and the rapid growth of what would soon become Christianity. The early writers shaped their texts not just to preserve memory, but to control meaning. If a bloodline threatened that control, if it opened the door to competing claims of authority, might it not have been trimmed away like a rogue vine on sacred ground? One controversial interpretation suggests the female disciples weren't just caretakers or followers, but part of a spiritual dynasty meant to continue the message of Christ through both word and blood. But the patriarchal structure of the church that followed had no room for daughters, no interest in a feminine legacy. It needed priests, not priestesses, councils, not wombs. Even the literary structure of the Gospels plays along. Women often appear at turning points, birth, death, resurrection, then vanish again. They're transitional characters, narrative midwives who usher in the divine but are never allowed to hold it. Their relationships with Jesus are emotionally charged, yet frustratingly vague. Close enough to care, but never quite defined. The texts don't contradict. They simply omit. Modern scholars, especially those revisiting early Christian communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, have started raising old questions with fresh evidence. Inscriptions that mention female apostles, tombs with Christian symbols but unexpected names, oral traditions passed down in rural villages in Syria, Lebanon, and southern France whispering of sacred daughters who fled the violence of empire and church alike. One thread leads back to the Gospel of Thomas, a non-canonical text discovered near Nag Hammadi. There in Logan 1:14, Peter protests that Mary Magdalene should leave because women are not worthy of life. Jesus replies with a cryptic line, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." A bizarre, jarring passage. Or is it code A, veiled reference to a female heir being forced into masculine roles to preserve legitimacy? Or perhaps a metaphor clumsily hiding something more literal? You start to see it not just in the words, but in the gaps between them. The Gospels are carefully tended gardens, and yet there are signs of weeding, selective pruning. Every gardener knows the feeling something once grew here. You can tell by the way the soil is shaped, by what shouldn't be empty. And so you turn the pages slowly like a detective in a dim-lit library, searching not for what's written, but for what was meant to be remembered, and wasn't. She appears in every gospel, always near the center, always somehow on the edge. Mary Magdalene is a puzzle, not just because of what is said about her, but because of what isn't. She is the first to witness the resurrection, the last to leave the cross, and often among the women who funded Jesus' ministry. And yet by the time Acts opens the curtain on the early church, she is nowhere to be found. Not a single word, not a farewell. She simply vanishes like a name scraped from stone. The church has told you for centuries that Magdalene was a repentant prostitute, a woman redeemed by grace, her sins washed away by tears and hair. But that characterization was a later invention, one cemented by Pope Gregory the Great in a sermon delivered in the year 591. Before that, she wasn't a harlot. She was something else, something harder to control. Some early Christian sects saw her as a teacher, a prophetess, perhaps even the rightful heir to Jesus' mission. And then, she was rewritten. That sudden shift, that careful reassignment of identity suggests fear. Because if Magdalene wasn't a sinner saved by Christ's mercy, what was she? Some traditions dared to whisper it. She was his wife, his companion, the mother of his child. It sounds fantastical, of course. Da Vinci Code territory. But let's peel that back and look at the history beneath the fiction. In Jewish culture of the first century, it would have been highly unusual, borderline scandalous for a 30-year-old rabbi to remain unmarried. Celibacy was not a virtue, it was a problem. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply wasn't just cultural, it was legal and sacred. Marriage was expected. It was assumed. A man without a wife was considered incomplete, even suspicious. So why would Jesus, hailed as rabbi even by his critics, be exempt from that norm? Some argue that his divine mission precluded earthly attachments. But others note that if Jesus had been married, his followers wouldn't have found it unusual, it wouldn't have needed to be mentioned at all. But if his spouse had become important, perhaps too important, then the omission starts to look strategic. And Magdalene wasn't just any follower. The Gospels describe her as present at the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection. She is the one Jesus appears to first after death. Not Peter, not John, her. He speaks her name and she recognizes him. In the Gospel of John, this scene unfolds like an intimate moment between two people who know each other deeply, not just as teacher and disciple, but with a kind of emotional shorthand that lovers develop over time. When she reaches for him, he tells her not to hold on, but it reads less like rejection and more like heartbreak, as if parting was not only necessary, but painful. Then there's the curious phrasing in the Gospel of Philip, a Gnostic text discovered in 1945. It refers to Mary as the companion of Jesus and uses a Greek term, koinonos, which implies a partner in an intimate, possibly spousal sense. The same text describes Jesus as frequently kissing her, causing the other disciples to grumble with jealousy. Now, of course, that could be metaphor. Gnostics loved metaphor. But it could also be memory encrypted, guarded, and coded through centuries of fear. One interpretation suggests that if Magdalene had borne a child, her immediate disappearance from official texts was not a coincidence, but a necessity. A daughter, perhaps, or even daughters, kept hidden from Rome, hidden from the church, hidden from history. And yet echoes remain in the sudden ferocity with which Magdalene was later discredited, transformed from a holy witness into a fallen woman, as if those in power were desperate to diffuse her significance, to make her unthreatening. And why would she be threatening unless she carried something no one else did? Some scholars believe the early rivalry between Peter and Mary Magdalene was more than theological. In the Pistis, Sophia, another Gnostic text, Peter complains that Mary is dominating the conversation and insists that she be silenced. Jesus refuses. He praises her insight. It plays like an ancient power struggle between apostolic succession and biological legacy, between the church and the bloodline. This tension reappears in various Gnostic communities, particularly those who venerated the divine feminine. For them, Mary Magdalene was not just a follower, she was the apostle to the apostles. The bearer of a truth the institutional church would spend centuries trying to bury. Perhaps that truth wasn't just theological. Perhaps it was genealogical. And then, as quickly as she arrived, she disappears. No mention of where she went, how she died, or who remembered her. No grave. No bones. Nothing but legends, whispers of a journey across the sea, of a child born in hiding, of a line that would stretch quietly across continents and centuries, waiting to be rediscovered. You begin to wonder, maybe the most dangerous woman in Christian history wasn't dangerous because of what she did. Maybe she was dangerous because of who she might have raised. You know the scene. Water into wine. Clay pots overflowing. A miracle of transformation toasted by guests who likely never realized history had just pivoted on a sip of red. The wedding at Cana has long been preached as the debut of Jesus' public ministry, a party trick with divine consequences. But you tilt your head and read it again this time, not for theology but for clues, not for miracle but for identity. And suddenly the story bends. In the Gospel of John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is already present when the story opens. That phrasing matters. She's already there. Then Jesus arrives along with his disciples. Mary turns to him not as an observer, but as someone with responsibility. They have no wine, she says. Not a question. Not a suggestion. It sounds more like a prompt, like a role he's expected to play. Like this isn't just any wedding. Like it's his. Most scholars brush this aside. They say she's nudging him to perform his first miracle. But if you read it as a wedding hosted by Jesus' own family, or even Jesus himself, it makes her concern about the wine profoundly practical. Running out of wine at a Jewish wedding wasn't just embarrassing, it was socially disastrous. A host's reputation could crumble under the weight of dry goblets. And who better to ensure the family's honor than a dutiful mother? It gets stranger. Jesus responds to her with a cryptic line. Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. A peculiar choice of words. Formal, detached, but also layered. If this truly is his wedding, then my hour might not refer to the crucifixion as tradition teaches, but to this moment. The beginning of something sacred. A union, a bond, or a revelation. Mary doesn't argue. She turns to the servants and simply says, do whatever he tells you, as if she already knows the outcome, as if this is a script they've all rehearsed before. And then come the vessels. 6 stone water jars, each holding 20 to 30 gallons, used for ritual purification. Jesus tells the servants to fill them. They obey, and suddenly they're pouring wine, the best wine, richer than what had been served before. A reverse in expectations. A miracle, yes, but also a metaphor. The old covenant has run dry. Something new has been poured. But here's the oddity: whose wedding is this? No names are given. No bride, no groom, not even the family hosting the event. You are told nothing except that Jesus is there, his mother is there, and he performs a miracle that draws gasps from the crowd. It's the only wedding mentioned in the Gospels, and yet it floats in abstraction untethered from the human details that weddings are built on. That's not just unusual. It's suspicious. There's a tradition, quiet, heretical, persistent, that the reason no groom is named is because the groom was Jesus. That this was the moment he married Mary Magdalene, not in secret, but in plain sight, veiled by careful narrative omission. That the miracle of Cana wasn't just about wine, it was about legacy. If that's true, it changes everything. Because a wedding implies family, a bride implies children, and children imply bloodlines that ripple through time. This interpretation, of course, is dismissed by Orthodox scholars. They argue there's no solid textual basis for such a claim, that it's conjecture, fantasy, romantic revisionism. But the Gnostic Gospels, those wild rejected scrolls tucked into clay jars in the Egyptian desert, don't entirely disagree. In texts like the Gospel of Philip, marriage is spiritual, sacred, and hidden from the uninitiated. It's suggested that Jesus and Mary Magdalene shared a union that transcended public record, that their bond was a mystery not to be paraded, but protected. If Jesus was indeed married, then the Gospel authors had a choice. They could acknowledge it and risk undermining the emerging theology of divine detachment, or they could obscure it. And if children were born, especially daughters, then hiding them became not just doctrinal necessity, but political survival. In later medieval folklore, particularly in the south of France, stories persist of a holy family arriving by sea. Mary Magdalene often accompanied by a dark-haired child, sometimes two, sometimes referred to as Sarah. The locals claim they came from Jerusalem fleeing persecution, that they brought relics and secrets. It is tempting to dismiss this as local legend, the kind of thing old women whisper in stone chapels while lighting candles. But then again, those stories never fully faded. They clung to the shoreline. They resurfaced in pilgrimage sites. They embedded themselves in names, in architecture, in art. And here's the question that won't go away. If the wedding at Cana wasn't Jesus, why is it told with such intimacy? Why does his mother act like a hostess? Why is there no mention of the couple at the center of the celebration? Maybe there was no need to name the bride, because she was already known, at least to those the story was originally told to. Maybe what has come down to us as miracle was once also memory. The start of a family line the world was never meant to remember. You begin to feel the weight of empty time. In the most influential biography in human history, there is a gap you could drive centuries through. Jesus disappears from the historical stage between the ages of 12 and 30. 18 years. Vanished. For a man whose words would ignite empires, the silence is deafening. The canonical Gospels give you a charming glimpse of him as a precocious 12-year-old debating elders in the temple, astonishing teachers with his insight. And then, nothing. Not a footstep, not a rumor, not even a passing reference. He returns at 30, baptized, radiant, with purpose, speaking as one with authority, as if he simply stepped out of a hidden life and into legend. For generations, theologians filled this gap with assumptions. Some say he worked as a carpenter in Nazareth, living quietly, honoring his mother, waiting for his hour. Others suggest he traveled perhaps to Egypt or even further east, studying mysticism and returning a sage. The theories are as varied as they are unprovable. But what if the silence hides something not mystical, but familial? Nazareth at the time was a tiny, forgettable village in the Galilean hills. Maybe 300 people. One main street. Everyone knew everyone. Marriages were arranged early, and the expectation of family was strong. A man in his 20s working healthy, pious would have been not just expected, but pressured to marry. If he hadn't, eyebrows would rise. If he had, and if children had followed, it would be part of the village's living memory. So why is that memory missing? Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it was suppressed. The early Christian writers had a theological agenda to fulfill, one that portrayed Jesus as divine, set apart, above the ordinary rhythms of life. A bachelor Messiah was more manageable. A father was complicated. There is a curious passage in Mark often overlooked where Jesus returns to Nazareth after his ministry begins. The villagers scoff. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joses, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? The tone drips with local contempt. But the detail is what lingers: brothers, sisters, neighbors. This is not the language of strangers describing a divine figure. It's the irritated grumbling of people who think they know you, who remember you differently, who resent your rise. The reference to his sisters, plural, unnamed, is especially intriguing. Women often ignored in lineage are here acknowledged. If sisters existed, what about daughters? Would they not have blended quietly into the village, married off their names, lost to time, or perhaps one of them left with her mother, across the sea, into hiding? There's another moment, quieter still, when Jesus tells a would-be disciple to follow him. The man asks for time to bury his father. Jesus replies, "Let the dead bury their dead." It is abrupt, cold even. Some see it as spiritual urgency. But others wonder, was it personal? Had Jesus himself already buried someone close, perhaps a father or a child? You follow the silence deeper. Into the apocryphal texts, the infancy gospel of Thomas, the proto-evangelium of James. They are strange, fragmented tales filled with miracles and myths. But buried in them are hints of family tension, domestic life, unexplained absences. One obscure Syriac fragment, rarely translated outside academic circles, tells of a woman named Mariamne, not to be confused with Mary Magdalene, who was said to have been a daughter of the prophet from Nazareth. It is a fleeting reference, dismissed by most. But it lingers like a ghost in a hall no one wants to walk. Even the idea of Jesus working with his hands carpentry, or more likely stonework given the region, is significant. In that world, a tradesman's tools were often passed to his children. Sons, typically, but not always. Especially not if the family was secretive, protective, mobile. A daughter might have learned at his side quietly, while the world remained unaware. You remember the rules of historical redaction. The things most often erased aren't the threats that scream, but the ones that whisper. A child hidden in a quiet town protected by silence. A family not denied outright, but simply unspoken. And so Nazareth, that dusty hilltop village, becomes not just the beginning, but perhaps the first crime scene. Not of violence, but of omission. Not of blood spilled, but blood denied. Perhaps the silence was not absence. Perhaps it was concealment. Perhaps those years were filled with love, with risk, with birth. And when the time came for Jesus to walk into the wilderness, perhaps he did not leave nothing behind, but someone. A daughter. Or daughters. And perhaps that silence was for them. The scroll was brittle when they found it. Tucked in a jar buried in the Egyptian desert, sleeping for over 1,000 years. When it was opened in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, scholars expected more of the same Gnostic riddles, poetic theology, speculative cosmology. But then they read a few particular lines, and the earth shifted ever so slightly. The Gospel of Philip was not a conventional gospel. It lacked narrative. No nativity, no crucifixion, just fragments, parables, and strange declarations. But one passage caught fire. It read, "And the companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. But Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the..." The text is torn. The next word is missing. But your imagination doesn't need help to guess. The line has triggered decades of theological migraines and scholarly debate, not because of what it says, but because of what it almost says. The term translated as companion is koinonos, a Greek word that can mean friend, partner, or spouse. It's the same word used in other early Christian writings to describe marital relationships. And yet, defenders of orthodoxy insist this passage is metaphorical. That it's spiritual intimacy, nothing more. But if that's true, why the jealousy, why the scandal? Why does Peter, in another Gnostic text, the Gospel of Mary, protest that Jesus would speak so openly to a woman and not to the men? You start to feel the pattern again. Jealousy, marginalization, omission. The men protest. Jesus praises her. Then later, when the story is rewritten, the woman disappears. The Gospel of Philip isn't coy about feminine symbols. It speaks of the bridal chamber of sacred unions of restoration through holy marriage. This wasn't Victorian coyness. It was an ancient theology in which union, real, embodied, sometimes sexual, was part of spiritual ascent. And in that theology, Mary Magdalene wasn't a sinner saved. She was a priestess, a partner, the bearer of a lineage. This is where things get sticky for the institutional church. Because if Christ had a companion, and if that companion bore children, Then apostolic succession, the chain of authority passed through Peter, might have a rival, a living bloodline. And in a patriarchal world, nothing is more dangerous than a woman with inheritance. It is here that the Church's machinery of erasure begins to look less like protection of doctrine and more like damage control. If Magdalene was more than a follower, if she was a wife or even the mother of daughters, then history had to be rewritten. Her status had to be reduced. Her body turned into an object of repentance rather than reverence. The bridal imagery hidden in mystical metaphor. But the Gnostic authors weren't playing coy. They described the bridal chamber as the place where the soul reunites with its origin, not in abstraction, but in union. The bride and bridegroom, heaven and earth. And for them, the union of Christ and Magdalene wasn't scandalous. It was essential. One interpretation whispered among certain esoteric circles suggests that the Gnostic tradition wasn't just preserving a theology, but protecting a memory. That the talk of sacred marriage, of hidden chambers and companions, was encoded testimony, not fiction, not allegory, testimony. And here Magdalene's role sharpens, not only as a disciple, not only as a woman Jesus loved, but as the gateway to something that needed safeguarding, a child, or children, the feminine extension of a divine-human hybrid, flesh carrying both heaven and history. There's an obscure fragment, little more than a line, referencing a group of early Christians who venerated a hidden mother figure symbolized by a dove and often depicted with a child in her lap, not Jesus, but a young girl. The Church labeled them heretics. Their images were destroyed, their records burned. But in a few quiet places, mosaics, carvings, marginalia, the figure persists. It makes you wonder, was the Gospel of Philip less a theological musing and more a cryptic confession? A whisper through time from someone who couldn't say what they knew directly, but left the breadcrumbs anyway. A kiss, a companion, a bridal chamber. And maybe the next word after kissed her often on the didn't matter as much as what it implied. Because whatever was there, it was too much for someone. So much so they made sure you couldn't read it. You come across her again and again like a shadow behind the veil, Sophia, the divine feminine. In the Gnostic texts, she is not a minor figure. She is cosmic. She is primordial. She is the embodiment of wisdom, the architect of matter, the sorrowful mother who births the world and longs to return to the light. But if you listen closely, you begin to hear an echo beneath the allegory, a softer voice speaking in human tones. And you begin to ask, is Sophia merely myth, or was she also memory? The Gnostic texts paint Sophia as a being who descended into chaos, sometimes by accident, sometimes in rebellion. She gives rise to the material world, becomes trapped in it, and seeks reunion with the divine. In some versions, she is rescued by Christ himself. In others, she is the one who calls him down, a co-savior, a partner, or perhaps a daughter. That last thought feels transgressive, but only because we've been trained to separate the mythic from the biological. Gnostics didn't. For them, all things mirrored each other. What happened in the heavens echoed on earth. What was cosmic was also corporeal. If Christ and Sophia were bound in a mystical dance, then their earthly counterparts, if they existed, would reflect that pattern. So who in the earthly life of Jesus reflects Sophia? Some say it is Mary Magdalene. She is wise, she is persecuted, she understands what the others do not. In several Gnostic texts, she is the only one who truly grasps Christ's teachings. Others say it could be his mother Mary, who also shares in divine mystery. But a more radical theory suggests that Sophia represents something the texts could only speak about, in code a literal daughter. The wisdom passed not through parable but through blood. One Gnostic hymn describes Sophia not as a goddess, but as a young maiden hidden in the world, her voice crying out from the wilderness. Another depicts her as clothed in light, but chained to a body waiting to be remembered. The language wavers between theology and longing, as if the writer isn't just composing doctrine, but grieving someone real. There's even a passage, fragmented, barely legible, that speaks of Sophia bearing the seed of the hidden one and raising a child not named. The mainstream scholars scoff. They say this is symbolic, a meditation on spiritual rebirth. But you've been walking through shadows too long to believe all children in Scripture are metaphors. In one of the texts, Christ refers to Sophia as the thought of the Father, and yet she moves independently, even rebelliously. She creates without permission. She gives life to something unexpected. She is divine but also flawed. That tension, reverence mixed with danger, feels eerily familiar. You begin to see how the institutional church would have had trouble with her. A divine, feminine, and independent creator, that was bad enough. But if she had a body, if she lived in flesh, bore children, taught apostles, then she was more than trouble. She was a threat. And so Sophia became myth. Wrapped in light, pushed into the clouds, safely abstracted from history. But you can still feel her presence. In the Gnostic obsession with sacred marriage, in the careful avoidance of feminine authority in canonical texts, in the way the Church preserved Christ as Logos, the Word, while quietly silencing wisdom. There's a saying among ancient mystics, the divine hides in plain sight, that what you think is a symbol may be something much closer. You consider that perhaps Sophia was once a real woman, a daughter of Christ, raised in exile, worshipped in secret, hidden behind layers of metaphor because that was the only way to protect her. Or perhaps she was many daughters, a line, a legacy, each generation carrying a little more of the hidden wisdom, not passed through books or bishops, but through lullabies and bloodlines, a whisper that said you came from something holy, and one day the world will remember. In the end, Sophia may be both myth and memory. A cosmic archetype, yes, but also a key. One that opens the door to a truth too dangerous to name. A truth that has been waiting patiently in the margins. The parchments were barely dry when the backlash began. Not from Rome, not from the empire, but from within. The early Christian movement, fragile and fragmented, soon found itself wrestling with a question that would shape the next 2 millennia: who gets to speak for God? And time and again, the loudest voices insisted it would not be women. You read the letters of the early church fathers, and you hear an undertone not just of piety, but of panic. Tertullian, brilliant and severe, wrote that it is not permitted for a woman to speak in church, nor to teach, nor to baptize. Clement of Alexandria described female beauty as a distraction from divine truth. Even Augustine, complex and conflicted, warned of the dangers of female temptation. They weren't simply trying to preserve order. They were laying bricks around a growing fear that women once empowered might claim authority that rivaled their own. Why such anxiety? What had they seen? You look back and the picture sharpens. Women were everywhere in the earliest Christian communities. They opened their homes for worship. They financed missions. They hosted the Eucharist. Some were called apostles, others prophets. Their names flicker in the New Testament: Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla, Chloe. But as the church institutionalized, moved from hidden homes to basilicas, from grassroots to hierarchy, those names began to vanish. There is one particularly telling shift. In Paul's earlier letters, he refers to women as co-workers and leaders. But by the time the pastoral epistles were written, letters many scholars believe were authored decades later under Paul's name, the tone changes. Now women are told to be silent, submissive, domestic. The transformation is not theological. It's political. And it wasn't just about general female leadership. It was about one woman in particular. Mary Magdalene. The Church Fathers rarely mention her in depth, and when they do, it's with faint praise or sharp suspicion. Her close relationship with Jesus, her centrality to the resurrection narrative, her unusual authority, these were problems. And problems require solutions. So she was rebranded, first as a repentant sinner, then as a cautionary tale, finally as a curiosity, saintly, yes, but safely irrelevant. Her Gnostic elevation as Christ's chosen interpreter was condemned as heresy, and the Gospels that gave her voice destroyed, or hidden. What remained were the voices of the men preserved, repeated, canonized. You find an obscure line in the writings of Irenaeus, a bishop in the 2nd century. He rails against those who say Christ confided his truth to women. His words are barbed, but the protest is revealing. No one argues with shadows, which means someone somewhere believed it. The suppression wasn't universal. In fringe communities, Montanists, Marcionites, later the Cathars, women held powerful roles. They preached, they prophesied, they healed, and always they paid the price. Persecution, exile, death. Inquisitions would come later, but the groundwork was laid early. The line between heretic and holy was drawn, and it was gendered. There's a case from the 3rd century, a woman named Thecla said to have baptized herself in a pool of lions, surviving executions and converting whole cities. Her story was so beloved, it circulated for centuries, but it was never canonized. The Church didn't want a female saint who saved herself. You begin to see the contours of something deeper. The erasure wasn't just reactive, it was preemptive. Because if Christ had daughters, if blood had passed from him into female heirs, then the Church's foundation built on apostolic succession through male disciples began to wobble. To preserve their authority, the men in robes needed silence, so they wrote it. Into doctrine, into liturgy, into law. They told the world that wisdom came through men, that holiness wore beards, that the womb was a vessel for obedience, not revelation. And those who disagreed, who whispered of a lineage of a secret, passed down from mother to daughter, were branded dangerous, exiled, burned. But here's the irony: the more they tried to silence the women, the louder their memory became. In the flicker of candles on Magdalene altars, in medieval paintings where a woman holds a chalice standing where no woman should stand, in folk tales about wise daughters who know truths the priests have forgotten, in names scratched into stone hidden in old cathedrals waiting, you realize something unsettling. The Church wasn't afraid that women would mislead. It was afraid they would remember. They say she came by boat, without sails, without oars. A vessel guided only by faith or fate, or something both softer and more deliberate. Mary Magdalene, along with a small band of followers, some say 2 women named Mary and Martha, others say a dark-skinned servant named Sarah, landed on the southern coast of what is now France. There in the salt-soaked air of the Camargue, she disappeared into legend, and perhaps into motherhood. The story has endured not because it was told from pulpits, but because it was whispered in kitchens. Passed from grandmother to child, embroidered into local hymns, painted into chapels, no bishop ever bothered to inspect. In the town now called Sainte Marie de la Mer, they celebrate her arrival every year with candles and processions, as if the boat might return, as if the memory still matters. But what if it wasn't just memory? According to Provençal folklore, Magdalene didn't just preach. She lived. She settled in a cave near Saint-Baume, deep in the forested hills, where water seeps from stone and the air never quite warms. The site has been venerated for centuries. Pilgrims come kneel, touch the cool walls, and whisper prayers into the shadows. But they rarely ask the obvious question, why would a woman flee to such a place unless she was hiding something precious? In this case, not scrolls, but someone. The legends grow bolder the further you wander inland. Stories of a child sometimes called Sarah, sometimes unnamed, said to be the daughter of Magdalene, and the man they no longer dared name. Locals spoke of a holy family that kept moving, never staying too long, always just beyond the reach of Roman law or church suspicion. Some believed the child had healing powers. Others said she bore a mark, a symbol, something passed from father to daughter. Skeptics will say it's folklore, that desperate times birth desperate stories. But the consistency of the tale across centuries, languages, and borders is troubling for those who prefer tidy history. Because the details shift, but the shape remains. A woman flees, a child is born, a lineage begins. What's particularly interesting is how this story latches itself onto geography. Unlike so many myths, this one has real places. The cave of Saint-Baume, the coastal landing point of Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer, the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, where relics believed to be Magdalene's were miraculously discovered in the 13th century, just in time to bolster church control over the growing cult that had flourished outside Vatican permission. That basilica contains a skull. The church claims it belongs to Mary Magdalene. They hold it in a golden reliquary shaped like a bust crowned with gems. But even they can't explain how it got there, or why the bones weren't found earlier, or who decided what was holy and what was dangerous. There's a curious medieval record kept by monks in Vézelay, another site claiming Magdalene's remains, which mentions a daughter of the Magdalene spirited away to avoid Roman vengeance. It's an isolated line, almost parenthetical. But monks didn't waste ink, and they didn't mention daughters by accident. Meanwhile, in the valleys of southern France, old families carry names tied to no noble house, bearing coats of arms with roses and chalices, symbols that feel more liturgical than feudal. Some of these families claim descent from no less than the Magdalene herself. They offer no proof, only stories. But those stories have survived fire, famine, and empire, which is more than can be said for most genealogies. There's an odd phenomenon too, one that modern historians tend to sidestep. Throughout the Middle Ages, small pockets of reverence for Mary Magdalene emerged in places never evangelized by Rome. Independent shrines, hidden altars, often built and maintained by women. They didn't just pray to her, they claimed her as their ancestor and their guide. You begin to suspect that if there was a bloodline, it didn't disappear. It adapted. It fled when it had to. Changed names, wore veils, married into other families. But it carried something more valuable than relics. It carried a memory. A story too dangerous to speak openly, but too sacred to forget. And perhaps that's why the Church never bothered to officially denounce the Provençal legends, because to attack them outright would give them power. Better to ignore the cave. Let the pilgrims come. Let the bones lie. Let the myth stay a myth, unless it isn't. Unless what arrived in Gaul wasn't just an evangelist, but an heir. They ruled from thrones that looked more like altars. Their hair, long and uncut, was said to shimmer with divine favor. Their banners bore strange symbols, bees, lilies, and 8-pointed stars, and their queens were often cloaked in mystery, marrying young and disappearing early. The Merovingians, the so-called long-haired kings of early medieval France, weren't just political rulers. They were treated by some with the reverence of a priesthood. And deep beneath their legends, beneath the blood-stained chronicles and the warlike poems, runs a quiet, persistent rumor that they carried holy blood. Not just royal blood. Holy. The dynasty begins with a figure named Merovech, a warrior born of two fathers, one human, the other, said to be a sea creature or divine being, depending on the telling. It sounds like myth, but in an age of sacred kingship origin, stories were currency, and Merovech's bloodline would go on to produce Clovis the Prince, who united the Franks, converted to Christianity, and laid the foundation for what would become modern France. But conversion didn't erase older beliefs. In fact, it amplified them. Because once Clovis was baptized, his blood became not just royal, but consecrated. And that made his descendants something else entirely. You notice something odd when reading early chronicles about these kings. They're obsessed with lineage. Chroniclers like Fredegar and Gregory of Tours bend over backward to link Merovingians to ancient houses, to biblical figures, to half-remembered patriarchs. But one thread keeps slipping through hints that the Merovingians were special, not because of their warcraft or wealth, but because of what flowed in their veins. This is where things get controversial. In the 20th century, authors like Gérard de Sède, and later more sensationally, the team behind Holy Blood, Holy Grail, claimed that the Merovingians were descended from the union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that the bloodline fled to Gaul, settled quietly, and eventually produced kings. The church, they argued, knew this, feared it, and erased it. Mainstream historians call this fantasy, a speculative spiral built on coincidences and conspiracy. But that's what they always say. What's more interesting is what can't be easily dismissed. The Merovingians were dethroned not by conquest, but by manipulation. The Carolingians, especially Pepin, the short father of Charlemagne, usurped them with papal blessing. Pope Zachary approved the switch, declaring that it was better for someone who actually held power to have the title of king. But why was that approval needed at all? Why not just conquer and be done with it? Unless there was something about Merovingian blood that still held sacred weight, something that couldn't be eliminated by the sword, only by theology. Even after their fall, the mystique of the Merovingians lingered. Monastic orders recorded their genealogies with near-obsessive detail. Certain noble families claimed descent from their line long after the name had faded from banners. And in southern France, especially in regions linked to the Magdalene legends, there were whispers of hidden heirs kept safe by secret orders. The Templars emerge around this time. Their founders, largely French nobles, established their headquarters near the very regions said to have sheltered the Magdalene and her descendants. Coincidence, perhaps. But one of the earliest documents tied to the Templars references their duty to guard the Holy Grail. Later writers assumed that meant a cup, but what if it meant something far more organic, Saint Graal, the Holy Grail? A mistranslation of sang real, the royal blood, a lineage, not a relic. One particularly curious artifact, the Dagobert II Charter, names a shadowy order called the Ormus, tasked with protecting sacred knowledge related to the Merovingian line. Dagobert himself, a Merovingian king, was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. His tomb was hidden, his heirs erased. The document was dismissed as a forgery because, of course, it was. Things like that always are, until they aren't. Modern DNA testing hasn't found a definitive holy bloodline, but then again, it's not looking for one. The Church has never made Magdalene's relics available for testing. The Vatican holds vast genealogical records untouched by independent scholars. The evidence is there if by there you mean in the vault, behind layers of Latin silence and time. And still the symbols persist. In rural churches, you find bees etched into stone. The fleur-de-lis, later associated with French royalty, appears first in Merovingian iconography. Some claim it represents purity. Others say it represents the womb, 3 petals, 3 lines, 3 lives, a trinity, or perhaps a lineage. And what of Sarah, the dark-skinned child from the Provençal coast, the one said to have arrived with Magdalene? In some versions of the legend, she doesn't just survive. She marries into a local noble line, and from that line, centuries later, emerges a dynasty that claims a throne. You realize the idea of a holy bloodline isn't merely romantic, it's disruptive. It suggests that divine authority doesn't flow from Rome or from creeds or from crowns, but through birth, through women, through those quietly erased from every ledger, every pulpit, every page. Perhaps the Merovingians weren't just kings. Perhaps they were keepers. High in the Languedoc hills of southern France, where the wind whispers through ruined castles and the bones of forgotten saints sleep beneath thyme and lavender, a war was waged not over land or gold, but over truth. Or at least the kind of truth too dangerous to survive. The enemy A group who called themselves the Good People. We know them as the Cathars. Officially, the Church called them heretics, dualists, enemies of Christ. But if you look past the bloodied papal bulls and torchlit executions, you find something stranger. You find silence where answers should be, and symbols where theology should be airtight. You find women leading rituals, men refusing to kill, and a doctrine that hints at a truth the Church buried under ash. The Cathars believed the material world was corrupt, created not by a benevolent God, but by a lesser power, what they called the demiurge. Salvation for them came through spiritual purity, simplicity, and a return to divine origin. So far so Gnostic. But it's not just their cosmology that worried Rome. It was their reverence for Mary Magdalene. To the Cathars, Magdalene wasn't just a repentant sinner. She was the embodiment of divine knowledge, the consort of Christ, the first apostle. In some of their underground texts, she is even said to have carried his spiritual essence after death, passed not through Peter's keys, but through her own flesh. In short, she was a vessel, possibly of memory, possibly of blood. And that made her dangerous. So dangerous, in fact, that the full weight of the Roman Church was unleashed upon her followers. In 1209, Pope Innocent III declared the Albigensian Crusade, a full-scale military assault against the Cathars. The command given to papal troops was as infamous as it was revealing, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The town of Béziers was the first to fall. Somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people were slaughtered. Not just warriors, not just preachers, but children, midwives, entire villages. You begin to see it, this wasn't just suppression, it was erasure. The Cathars had no churches, no altars. They gathered in homes, caves, meadows. Women were granted spiritual authority equal to men. Their leaders, called perfecti, lived in poverty and refused to lie. Among them, whispers were shared of a lineage, one that survived in hiding. Some claimed Magdalene had come to Gaul not as a missionary, but as a mother. That her child, possibly a daughter, had founded a line of spiritual teachers protected by ritual and obscured by metaphor. To modern ears, this sounds like legend, like the kind of tale you tell after too much wine under stars too bright to be questioned. But the Church's response wasn't metaphorical. It was fire, siege, sword. Over the course of 4 decades, Catharism was hunted to near extinction. In 1244, the last stronghold of the Cathars, Montségur, fell after a 10-month siege. Over 200 perfecti were burned alive at the base of the fortress. Some say they walked into the flames, singing. Others say they refused to renounce Magdalene, that they believed they were guarding something sacred, something not yet ready to be revealed. What were they protecting? The Inquisition followed just to make sure. Records were kept, names were taken, books destroyed, but not all of them. Some fragments survived hidden in carved boxes concealed in false walls, later smuggled into libraries in Amsterdam, Prague, and even Istanbul. And in those fragments, Magdalene appears again. Never as a footnote, always as the heart of something the priests couldn't quite explain. A 14th-century Occitan manuscript buried for centuries in a monastery cellar speaks of la sangue escondida, the hidden blood. A phrase repeated 3 times. It doesn't say whose blood, it doesn't say where it flows, but the language is specific. Hidden, not lost. Blood, not myth. Some modern scholars propose that the Cathars preserved more than theology, that they inherited fragments of an oral tradition passed down from exiles, women, and wandering mystics, that they didn't just believe in a feminine divine, they remembered her, perhaps even knew her descendants. And what better way to extinguish a lineage than to burn the memory from the living? You look at the ruins now, the scorched stones of Montségur, the crumbled sanctuaries in Minerve and Lavore. You hear the wind whistle through the fractured walls and wonder how many names it carries. How many were lost, and how many still linger in the blood of those who don't even know. If a daughter of Christ once walked those hills, this is where she would have vanished. Among a people who believed the world was broken, but that love, secret, sacred love, could still carry salvation. And maybe, just maybe, a name. They rode under a red cross and swore oaths deeper than silence. Officially, they were warrior monks, soldiers of Christ, guardians of pilgrims. But no one ever really believed that was all they were. The Knights Templar remain one of the most misunderstood orders in history, cloaked in as much legend as armor. And within those legends lies a persistent whisper that their true purpose wasn't just to protect the Holy Land, but to protect something far older. A secret not of stone or scrolls, but of blood. Not just any blood. Holy blood. You start with the basics. The Templars were founded in 1110, shortly after the First Crusade, by 9 knights who established themselves in Jerusalem, specifically on the Temple Mount. But instead of protecting pilgrims, as the story goes, they spent their early years digging beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Digging for what some claim it was the Ark of the Covenant. Others, sacred relics. But one theory suggests they were after genealogical records documents that proved the existence of a bloodline descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Records that would have undermined the entire authority structure of the Church. Because if Christ had children, and those children survived, their descendants would carry a claim far greater than any bishop or pope. The Magdalene legends in southern France were alive and well by the time the Templars rose to power. Many of the original knights were from the Languedoc region, the very land where Cathars once thrived, where rumors of Christ's bloodline still echoed in stone villages and hidden caves. The overlap is suspicious, coincidental if you're feeling generous. But then again, nothing about the Templars was ever simple. They grew powerful fast, too fast. Within a century, they controlled more wealth than some kings. They established their own banking system, held lands across Europe, answered to no monarch, only the Pope. And yet their internal practices were secretive. Their initiation rites never fully understood. their worship shrouded in rumor. Accusations of heresy began to swirl that they venerated a head, a feminine figure, a chalice. Some said they worshipped a goddess. Others said they kissed each other's spines in the dark. Absurd, yes, but maybe also distorted echoes of something truer. The chalice appears again and again. The Grail. Often imagined as a cup, but in older lore it is something else entirely. A vessel, a womb. And in certain esoteric interpretations, the Grail isn't a thing, it's a person, a woman, or her descendants. If the Templars found evidence of a divine bloodline, they would not have made it public. They would have hidden it, guarded it, venerated it. Perhaps even made it the core of their true faith, an unspoken reverence for the lineage of Christ, passed not through Rome, but through the womb of a woman exiled to Gaul. And this might explain their downfall. In 1307, on Friday the 13th, the Templars were arrested en masse by the command of King Philip IV of France. Accused of blasphemy, idol worship, and unspeakable rites, they were tortured into confession, burned, imprisoned, dismantled. The Church stood by complicit. The Pope disbanded the order. Their lands were seized, their leaders executed, and the secret, whatever it was, went underground. But before his death, Grand Master Jacques de Molay reportedly cursed both the Pope and the King. Within a year, both men were dead. A coincidence, perhaps, or the final act of a man who carried knowledge that made the Church tremble. Many believe the Templars didn't die, that they went into hiding, that they morphed into other groups. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, guardians of secrets, passed through symbols, not scripture. Some of their encrypted documents, when decoded, include references to the feminine vessel, the bride, and the hidden line. Always vague, always veiled, but always present. You think back to the symbols on their seals: 2 knights on 1 horse, the red cross, the downward pointing triangle, feminine shapes wrapped in martial glory. There are depictions of Magdalene in Templar chapels not as a sinner, but as a queen. In one fresco, she stands over a serpent crowned and holding a child. Not Jesus, someone younger and unnamed. In Portugal, where Templars were reconstituted as the Order of Christ, the legends persisted. Knights sailed west carrying not gold, but texts, relics, names. In some stories, they took the lineage with them, across oceans, into new lands. Waiting, you consider the possibility: what if their true mission wasn't conquest or defense, but preservation? What if they believed the blood of Christ had passed into flesh, into daughters, into generations? And what if they saw themselves not as warriors, but as midwives to a secret too sacred for daylight? If that were true, then their fall wasn't a failure. It was a smokescreen, a ritual disappearance, a burial in plain sight. And perhaps beneath the charred remains of their commanderies, under symbols carved in stone, lies a simple truth: that they weren't guarding treasure. They were guarding a womb. The village is small. Perched on a windswept hill in southern France, it clings to the landscape like a forgotten story waiting to be reread. Ren-le-Chateau. On the surface, it's unremarkable. A quiet church, a few winding streets, a view that stretches across the Languedoc like a tapestry. But beneath the soil, beneath the floorboards, beneath the altar, is a whisper. One that has refused to die for over a century. It begins in 1885 when a young priest named Béranger Saunière arrived to take charge of the parish. The church of St. Mary Magdalene was crumbling. The congregation was sparse. The pay was meager. But within a few years, Saunière began spending money lavishly. He restored the church in bizarre and opulent fashion. installed statues of demons and angels, inscriptions with peculiar messages, hidden symbols. He built a villa, a tower, and a lavish estate. His guests included bishops, aristocrats, and occult scholars. All from a rural priest's salary, of course not. Saunière claimed he'd found something during renovations, buried beneath the altar or hidden in the hollow of a Visigothic pillar. No one knows for certain, but his sudden wealth, his secretive behavior, and his refusal to explain where the money came from set tongues wagging. The church launched an investigation. Saunière stonewalled them. Eventually, he was suspended not for heresy, but for accounting irregularities. The official records end there, but the legends, they were just beginning. According to one of the more persistent tales, Saunière discovered parchments, ancient documents hidden by previous priests. Some say they were genealogies, others maps. One interpretation claims they proved the survival of a sacred bloodline descending from Jesus, and Mary Magdalene quietly protected in the south of France for centuries. That's right. The daughters of Christ. If that sounds familiar, it should. The legends of Magdalene arriving in Gaul, of a daughter named Sarah, of Cathars and Templars and hidden heirs, all of it converges here in this sleepy hilltop village. Ren-le-Chateau became the gravitational center for every theory, every code, every name half erased by time. It was, some believed, the repository of the secret. Even the decor of Saunière's church raises eyebrows. The demon Asmodeus, perched at the entrance, supports a font of holy water. Above him, stained glass windows depict scenes with unsettling symbolism: lilies, serpents, veiled figures. There is an inscription above the door that reads, "This place is terrible." Visitors who notice the peculiar positioning of statues, Joseph opposite Mary Magdalene, angels pointing at nothing, come away with more questions than answers. And then there's the Tour Magdala, the tower Saunière built on the edge of his estate. He claimed it was a library. But what kind of books were kept inside? The name alone, Magdala, evokes the Magdalene, the woman at the heart of this mystery. A woman stripped of her name, then memorialized in stone by a man who seemed to know something the church wished he hadn't. One of the strangest facts, Saunière was offered money to keep quiet. A letter from his housekeeper found after her death mentions that he received support from above in exchange for custody of the truth. Whether that support came from the church, a noble family, or a secret order, no one knows. But he never left Ren-le-Chateau again. Never spent a single franc of his wealth outside the village, as if he feared being watched, or worse, being followed. Decades later, in the 1950s and 60s, researchers began digging literally and figuratively. Gérard de Sède published books speculating on Saunière's secret. Later, conspiracy theorists, grail hunters, and even novelists would descend, linking Ren-le-Chateau to everything from the Knights Templar to the Priory of Sion. The town became a pilgrimage site for seekers of forbidden history. The church, for its part, remained mostly silent. There are clues buried in plain sight. A tombstone Saunière allegedly altered, rearranging the inscription into what some call a cipher, a coded parchment found in nearby caves. Even the name Ren, which some claim is derived from the word reine or queen. Queen of what, of whom some theorists suggest that Saunière found proof not just of a bloodline, but of a living heir. Someone who had survived centuries of obscurity, protected by families loyal to the Magdalene's memory. Others believe the priest uncovered the final link in a chain stretching back to Jerusalem, a record that showed the children of Christ had not vanished, but scattered. Whatever he found, he took it to his grave. He died suddenly in 1917. On his deathbed, he reportedly confessed something to his confessor so disturbing that the man refused to give him last rites. No one ever wrote down what he said. But the mystery endures. Because here atop a lonely hill in France, a quiet priest may have stumbled upon the most disruptive truth in history. A truth so dangerous, it had to be buried in stone and wrapped in legend, that the daughters of Christ were not legend. They were legacy. If silence has a temple, it is here. Beneath the bustling streets of Vatican City lies a vault so vast it stretches for more than 50 miles. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, once called the Secret Archives, until that name began attracting the wrong sort of attention, hold centuries of documents, letters, decrees, and reports. Some are mundane, most are not. And among the shelves of bound vellum and iron-stamped codices, there is one question that echoes louder than any liturgical chant. What does the Church still know about the bloodline? You picture the setting, climate-controlled corridors flanked by ancient walls, dim overhead lights casting long shadows across Latin scrolls no one outside the Church has touched in centuries. Even accredited scholars require months of vetting to access specific folders, and what they request must be known in advance. You cannot browse, you cannot wander. You may ask for what you already know exists. Anything else remains unacknowledged. So you begin to ask the question sideways. What documents were destroyed? Which collections remain mysteriously uncatalogued? Why are certain time periods the years immediately following the crucifixion, for instance, or the precise records of church councils dealing with Gnostic texts so frustratingly sparse? There is a whisper that in the 4th century, under Constantine's patronage, certain scrolls were quietly removed from circulation, not burned, not lost, but filed away. One theory holds that among them were family records tied to the early Christian communities in Jerusalem. Genealogies, baptismal logs, letters exchanged between the so-called desposini, the descendants of Jesus' family, who were still active well into the 2nd century. Early church writers mention these individuals briefly and then never again. Eusebius, the first major church historian, refers to them as those of the Lord's family, some of whom were arrested by Roman authorities and questioned about their claim to lineage. Why would Rome care? Because in that world, dynasties mattered. Even spiritual ones. A family with claim to the Messiah could challenge both empire and ecclesiastical hierarchy. There's an odd entry long buried in a 17th century inventory of the Vatican archive, a bundle of sealed parchments labeled Sanguis Iesu, the blood of Jesus. It disappears from subsequent records. No mention of its contents. No reference in modern catalogs. Did it ever exist? Or was it renamed, relocated, buried deeper? Then there's the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books. It included many Gnostic Gospels, particularly those that elevated Mary Magdalene or hinted at familial ties between her and Jesus. Why censor them so thoroughly if they were fantasy? Why fear them? Even more curious, certain documents released from the Vatican during World War II as part of international diplomacy included cryptic references to the Magdalene tradition, not in a theological context, but in geopolitical ones. Apparently, some noble families still traced their line to southern France, and the Vatican kept records, just in case. And here's where the trail turns strange. In 1979, a researcher reportedly found a sealed envelope among the archives of a deceased cardinal. Inside were sketches of church floor plans, fragments of Occitan text, and a stylized rose entwined with a cross. The rose has long been associated with secrecy and in esoteric tradition with the feminine divine. The cross, of course, needs no translation. What made this unusual was the final line scrawled in Latin, custodita usque ad tempus revelandum, guarded until the time of revealing. The envelope vanished shortly thereafter. No explanation was given. Then, of course, there are the rumors that deep within the archives lies an unbroken genealogy, that Christ's bloodline didn't vanish but simply went underground, that the Church has tracked it for centuries, not to preserve it, but to ensure it never surfaces. To the outside world, the Vatican insists these are just legends, that the archives exist for scholarly preservation, that there are no secrets, only history. But even within the Church, voices have cracked through. Monsignor Luigi Marinelli, a Vatican insider, wrote anonymously in the 1990s about the knowledge that cannot be spoken. He never said what it was. He didn't have to. And so the archives remain, still guarded, still growing. You wonder if somewhere in the darkest wing of that silent maze sits a file marked with names, not saints, not martyrs, daughters. Not all power comes from pulpits. Not all devotion lives in books. Some faith lingers in soil, passed from hand to hand, like heirloom seeds, quiet, resilient, rooted in something older than dogma. As the Church expanded its reach across Europe, it left statues, cathedrals, and councils in its wake. But in the hills and valleys of southern Europe, something else persisted. Something humbler. Something feminine. They call them cults, but not in the modern sense. In the medieval world, a cult was a local tradition, a veneration of a saint, a relic, a miracle. And across France, Italy, and parts of Spain, cults devoted to Mary Magdalene began to bloom like wildflowers in places Rome never fully tamed. At Saint-Baume, pilgrims climbed the rocky path to the cave where Magdalene was said to have lived in exile. They bring water rosaries, names whispered into the wind. The cave is damp, cloaked in moss, and silence lit by flickering candles. The Church acknowledges the site now, but only because it couldn't suppress it. For centuries, this was a lay tradition. Women cared for the cave. Women told the stories. They never asked for permission. Then there's Vézelay, a majestic basilica in Burgundy that claims to house Magdalene's remains. A magnificent tomb. Impressive relics. But beneath the grand architecture, the old folk stories persist, tales of a child born during exile, a girl who grew up under stars and secrecy, said to have carried her mother's voice and her father's light. In Provence, the town of Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer celebrates the arrival of 3 Marys by boat: Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, and Mary Jacob. But the most venerated figure is a dark-skinned girl named Sara Lacali, believed by the Romani to be the daughter of Magdalene. Every May she is paraded into the sea, cloaked in color and incense. The Church for centuries ignored the practice. It still does not officially recognize Sara as a saint, and that tells you everything. The cults of Magdalene weren't centered on theology. They were centered on memory, a different kind of memory, one where Magdalene was not a penitent. She was a matriarch. In early local hymns, she is sometimes called La Mère Cachée, the hidden mother. Not metaphorically, physically, one of flesh and womb and name. Her statues are different too. In certain chapels, she is not kneeling. She is standing, holding a chalice or a child. Her robes are red, not for sin, but for lineage. Her face calm, knowing, and in some carvings she wears a crown. These are not flourishes of art. These are hints. Why did these images survive? Because they were made by hands unafraid. In remote regions where the priest visited once a year, but the midwife came every week. Where the stories were told around bread ovens, not altars. Where women remembered what the bishops had forgotten or had erased. One 13th century French poem recorded in a village dialect and nearly lost to time tells of La rose et l'étoile, the rose and the star. The rose was Magdalene, The star was her daughter. They travel together, always hidden, always moving. The poem ends not with death, but with birth. The line continues. The star becomes a woman, then a mother, then a mystery again. In parts of Catalonia, women still leave offerings at shrines to Maria Vermella, the Red Mary, not the Virgin, not a martyr. A woman with stories no priest can explain. The local church accepts the offerings, but no one preaches her name from the pulpit. And that's the point. The Magdalene cults didn't seek confrontation. They offered an alternative, a secret line of grace, a holy femininity. Not the cold chastity of cloisters, but the warm inheritance of body and voice. They honored her as a vessel not just of witness, but of life. Some scholars argue this was simply a regional reaction to the harshness of church patriarchy. Others suggest it was something more deliberate, a survival mechanism, that the bloodline of Christ, unable to assert itself publicly, embedded itself in culture instead, in symbols, in processions, in lullabies sung to daughters with dark eyes and secret names. The church never launched a crusade against the Magdalene cults. It didn't need to. It simply absorbed what it could, censored what it feared, and let the rest fade into the margins. But they didn't fade. The candles still burn. The statues still smile. And in the quiet rituals of Southern Europe, a different gospel is told. Not written in Greek, but in gesture. Not preserved by scribes, but by grandmothers. Not about salvation from sin, but about the survival of a lineage. Paintings do not preach. They suggest. They murmur. They survive. Long after councils have argued, after parchments have burned, after dogmas have calcified into doctrine, the art remains hanging quietly in dim-lit chapels, etched into stone columns, peering down from cathedral domes. And sometimes it reveals more than it was ever meant to. The church controlled theology with a steel grip, but art had loopholes, especially in the medieval and Renaissance worlds, where most patrons were wealthy bishops who didn't always inspect every brushstroke, and most viewers couldn't read Latin anyway. What passed as devotional could also be dangerous, and what slipped through was at times astonishing. Mary Magdalene appears in hundreds of paintings, often weeping, often penitent, often alone in a desert. But occasionally she appears different, regal, radiant, pregnant. In a 15th century fresco tucked in a monastery in Tuscany, Magdalene stands beside a young girl. The child's features mirror hers. The girl holds a scroll, Magdalene a key. The caption simply reads, Domina Silenti, Lady of Silence. A curious title, not scriptural, not doctrinal, almost protective. Who is this child? Why the secrecy elsewhere in a cathedral apse in northern Spain? A mural depicts the descent from the cross. But unusually, Mary Magdalene is not at Christ's feet. She is at his side, her hand on his ribcage, as if cradling not his death but something inside. Her face is not sorrowful. It is determined. Her other hand rests low on her abdomen. Subtle, deliberate. A gesture no one notices until they know what to look for. Then there's the imagery of the chalice. Traditionally associated with the Last Supper, the chalice becomes something else in later art, especially in French Gothic sculpture. In niches around the Magdalene altar at Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, she is depicted holding a cup, sometimes upright, sometimes inverted. In several, the chalice glows. In one, it rests upon her womb. The metaphor, of course, is clear. She is the vessel, but perhaps not just of faith. Italian altarpieces often depict the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, the child Jesus. But tucked away in lesser-known triptychs, particularly those commissioned by esoteric confraternities, you sometimes find a fourth figure, a young woman standing just behind Mary. Not a servant, not a cousin. Her face is serene, her dress crimson, her hands resting protectively on a child not in swaddling clothes, but in simple linen. Not Jesus, a different child. One Flemish engraving from the 17th century, long dismissed as allegorical, portrays the crucifixion with three figures in shadow behind the crowd. A woman, her face partially obscured, holds a young girl whose gaze is fixed directly on the viewer. The mother's hand covers the child's heart. A line of text beneath them reads, Veritas latet in sanguine. Truth hides in blood. It would be easy to wave all of this away. Artistic flourish, symbolism, misinterpretation. But the patterns persist across time, language, region. Artists who never knew each other, commissioned in cities separated by mountains and centuries, all quietly inserting Magdalene as something more than penitent, something maternal, something dynastic. And then there's the color, red. In standard iconography, Magdalene wears red to mark her as a sinner. But in these subversive works, red is no longer shame, it is inheritance. It appears on veils, belts, cuffs, often in shapes that resemble vines. Bloodlines, perhaps. Always connected to children's scrolls or vessels. And when artists wanted to be even more discreet, they turned to geometry. The vesica piscis, a pointed oval shape formed by the overlap of two circles, is often used as a framing device around female saints. But when placed specifically around Magdalene and accompanied by a child or an open book, it becomes unmistakable this is not about sanctity, it is about sacred birth. During the Counter-Reformation, many of these works were quietly removed, repainted, or misattributed. Magdalene's image was standardized, barefoot weeping, clutching a skull, a safe icon, contained. But a few artists resisted. Caravaggio, that scoundrel of light and shadow, painted Magdalene not with tears, but with knowing. In The Penitent, Magdalene, she gazes not at the cross, but slightly past it at something out of frame. Her hand rests on her lap near a gold chain. The skull beside her is turned away. As if death is not the end of the story. Even Leonardo da Vinci, obsessed with symmetry, mystery, and the feminine, drew sketches of a woman labeled only Maria, pregnant and cloaked. She stands beside a structure that some scholars identify as the Magdalene Tower. The date is unclear. The intention even more so. But if art is confession, these images speak loudly. They tell you that the story didn't end at the tomb, that somewhere in color and form truth persisted where words were forbidden, that Magdalene was not forgotten. She was encrypted, and within her arms, brushstroke by brushstroke, the child appears again. He's mentioned in passing, rarely preached about, often misremembered. James, the so-called brother of the Lord. Not cousin, not symbolic sibling, brother. And once you acknowledge that detail, everything begins to unravel quietly but thoroughly. James of Jerusalem, as he was later known, led the early Christian community after Jesus' death. While Peter traveled and Paul wrote letters from Roman prisons, James held the center. He presided over the earliest council of believers, settled disputes between Jewish and Gentile factions, and was known throughout Judea as James the Just, a man of remarkable piety and influence. And yet his position in the New Testament is surprisingly muted. You start to wonder why. If James was indeed Jesus' literal brother, born of the same mother, possibly of the same blood, his leadership would have carried an authority the apostles could never match. In a culture that revered lineage, James's biological connection to Jesus would have placed him and any children he may have had in a unique, dangerous position. And therein lies the problem. If the early church had embraced a hereditary model of leadership, one based on Jesus' own family, then spiritual authority would have passed not through Peter or Paul, but through James, and then, perhaps to James's children, perhaps even to daughters. But you won't find those descendants in the official records. You'll find them only in fragments. A few church fathers mention James. Hegesippus, writing in the 2nd century, claims that James wore priestly robes and entered the Holy of Holies, that he was revered by all sects in Jerusalem until his death. Josephus, the Jewish historian, confirms that James was stoned to death by temple authorities, a martyr not for doctrine but for influence. Then comes the strange line in Eusebius, the early Christian historian. He writes that after James's death, those of the Lord's family were still known and watched by Rome, that they were questioned by Emperor Domitian as potential threats. This isn't fiction. This is an imperial record. Why would the Roman Empire fear relatives of a dead preacher? Unless his bloodline still mattered. The desposini, those descended from Jesus' family, are referenced in just a few scattered texts. They were not heretics, not Gnostics. They were part of the early mainstream movement. And yet their presence fades after the 3rd century. No councils ever debated them. No saints rose from their line. No tombs commemorate them. It's as if the family of Christ was deliberately written out of the official genealogy of Christianity. And perhaps they were, because the implications were profound. A surviving bloodline would mean an alternative authority, one not ordained by apostolic succession, but born from the same womb as Christ. If James had children, and those children had children, then the church would face a competing claim: leadership by blood versus leadership by doctrine. And what if one of those children wasn't a son? You return to that line from earlier: James's sisters, plural, unnamed. Their absence is glaring. If they existed, why were they not acknowledged? Could one of them have been married off, quietly sent away, or could one have carried a child with a claim even stronger than James's in some apocryphal Gospels? James is described not only as Jesus' brother, but as a witness to secret teachings. In one version of the Gospel of Thomas, James is the righteous one for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. A poetic elevation or a coded acknowledgement of his importance. Either way, it suggests that James wasn't just a figurehead. He was a guardian, perhaps of memory, perhaps of something more tangible, a lineage. Some speculate that the early conflict between James and Paul, subtly referenced in Acts and more heated in Paul's letters, was more than theological. That it was a power struggle between two visions of leadership, one based on revelation, the other on relationship. Paul never met Jesus in life. James grew up beside him. The church chose Paul. In time, James was canonized, sanitized, tucked into a corner of Scripture where few would look too closely. His death was mourned. His sainthood proclaimed, his legacy buried under creeds and councils. And yet the fragments persist. In Eastern Christian traditions, especially in Syria and Armenia, there are stories of a holy family who fled persecution carrying scrolls and relics. Some traditions link these to James's descendants. Others whisper of a girl, quiet, luminous, raised in the memory of her uncle. There is no official genealogy for Christ's family, no tree carved in stone. But there are names, half-erased stories, half-told faces painted beside Magdalene that no one can quite explain. And James, quiet James, may have been the first branch in that tree. The one they chose not to prune, but to uproot entirely. You return to the desert, not the one with sand and sun, but the intellectual desert where the early church fathers feared their sheep might wander. It is here in the pages of Gnostic scripture unearthed at Nag Hammadi in 1945 that a very different kind of Christianity lives and breathes, one in which the divine is not only masculine, one in which wisdom Sophia is not a trait but a person, and one where salvation doesn't come through belief alone, but through memory. Memory passed from woman to woman, womb to womb. It's not a metaphor. Gnosticism in its many forms is less a doctrine than a language of symbols, ever fluid, ever dangerous to systems built on rigid hierarchy. But within its fragmented texts, the thunder-perfect mind, trimorphic protanoia, the Gospel of Mary, you find a pattern, a structure that defies apostolic succession, a transmission of knowledge through bloodlines, not through councils, a spiritual inheritance encoded in the feminine. In one Gnostic poem, the divine voice says, "I am the one whose womb gives birth to the light." In another, "I am the mother, the daughter, and the sister." The language is not poetic fluff, it is cosmological architecture. The womb in these texts is not incidental, it is central. Not just as a biological function, but as a sacred conduit where the spirit moves into flesh, where hidden knowledge sleeps until it is awakened. If you step back and squint a little, the implication becomes clear. What if in the minds of these early mystics, the divine wasn't merely present in Christ, but extended through his lineage, not through Peter or Paul, but through Mary Magdalene? And the daughters who followed you, think of those cults in southern France of Sarah Lacaille and the Magdalene Caves. You think of the rumors from the Templar frescoes of the rose cradled in a triangle. You think of the stories that refuse to die because they are carried in the bodies of women who never asked for permission to remember. The Gnostics never built cathedrals, but they wrote as if the soul was a temple, and the feminine was its veil. They believed that knowledge of the divine came not through ordination, but through awakening. That the sacred feminine had been silenced by rulers, by priests, by empire, but could not be destroyed, only hidden, until the right time. One obscure scroll, the Dialogue of the Savior, records Jesus speaking to a group of disciples. Mary Magdalene is among them. At one point the others ask, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" His reply, "Why do I not love you as I love her?" The message is clear. There is a transmission occurring, and it isn't evenly distributed. Another fragment speaks of a woman who shall carry the wisdom of the aeons in her blood. Some interpret this as allegory. Others suspect it was code, a reference not to metaphorical gnosis, but to real inheritance. Biological, maternal, a lineage of women not just bearing children, but bearing secrets. The kind no bishop could record. The kind that would get you burned. And perhaps that was the point. The institutional church required hierarchy, apostolic succession, chain of command. But the Gnostic model was something else, entirely a tree without a trunk, where branches extended in all directions, and fruit passed from hand to hand. No wonder it had to be cut down. Over time, the feminine vanished from mainstream theology. Sophia became an echo. Magdalene became a footnote. The womb became a cautionary tale. But the older texts lingered, buried, copied, translated in secret, passed among mystics and midwives through whispered rites and underground rituals. And in those stories, a strange resilience took root. Perhaps the reason we find no official record of Christ's daughters is because we've been looking in the wrong archive. The Vatican may guard what it can, but memory is slippery. Memory lives in lullabies, in embroidery, in stories passed down by firelight. Memory can be womb-shaped. There are oral traditions still alive in parts of Greece and the Levant that speak of a holy mother of mothers, not the Virgin, but a veiled woman who fled the cross carrying more than grief. She taught not by preaching, but by singing. Her daughters did the same. Some of the songs survive woven into local folk music, their words mostly forgotten, but the melody always the same. You realize the transmission was never doctrinal. It was biological, emotional, in the curve of a hand, in the sway of a prayer, in the quiet courage of those who remembered what the world told them to forget. A feminine line, not of hierarchy but of holding, not of priests, of mothers. It was hidden like all the rest. Torn pages buried in sand, scattered in fragments, one of the earliest and most suppressed voices in the Christian world. The Gospel of Mary attributed to Mary Magdalene was never given a seat at the council tables, never recited in the candlelit rhythm of Sunday liturgies. And perhaps that was the plan all along. Because what it says changes everything. The surviving portions of this gospel, first discovered in the late 19th century, with additional fragments unearthed in Egypt, begin after the resurrection. The disciples are frightened. Jesus has left them. Their unity is cracking. Peter, as usual, voices doubt, and then Mary speaks, calmly, with authority. She says the Savior revealed special teachings to her privately. Teachings about the soul, the journey through celestial realms, the path to inner peace. And Peter's response? He doesn't challenge the message. He challenges her right to speak it. Did he really speak to a woman in private, he asks, and not openly to us? Are we to turn around and all listen to her? Did he choose her over us? It is the oldest protest in the book, and it echoes loudly. Levi, another disciple, defends her. He rebukes Peter, saying, "If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" Then he adds, "Surely the Savior knows her well. That is why he loved her more than us." The implications here are staggering, not just for theology, but for history. This isn't just a woman holding secret knowledge. It's a woman being acknowledged by other apostles as more trusted, more beloved, perhaps even more chosen. And the church knew it. Which is why, for centuries, this gospel was buried, dismissed as Gnostic, rambling, marginalized, as mystical poetry. But it isn't poetry. It's a declaration. In it, Mary Magdalene is not a sinner. She is not even merely a disciple. She is the witness, the one who truly understood the teachings, not because she was told to, because she lived them. And if Jesus taught her in secret, if their relationship was deeper, more intimate, more familial than the surviving Gospels dare say, then the question becomes, why would the church go to such lengths to silence her? Some say it was simple patriarchy, that women couldn't be allowed spiritual authority. That's certainly part of it. But others see something more, something encoded in what was left unsaid. Why do none of the canonical Gospels describe Mary's fate after the resurrection? Why is there no mention of where she went, who she stayed with, what happened to her? Every other major figure in Christ's circle is accounted for. Peter goes to Rome. Paul writes his letters. John guards the churches of Asia Minor. But Mary nothing. Unless, of course, you consider the possibility that her path was meant to remain hidden. Perhaps because she wasn't just carrying teachings. Perhaps because she was carrying something far more dangerous. There's a passage in the Gospel of Mary that speaks of the soul's journey through the heavens, where it must answer the powers that rule the world. At each gate, the soul must declare its freedom from bondage, its lack of attachment to the material, to desire, to ignorance. It reads like mystical philosophy. But it also reads like allegory. A soul escaping something. A woman fleeing persecution. A lineage in exile. One theory, as controversial as it is persistent, holds that Mary fled Jerusalem with child. that the teachings she carried were not just spoken words, but embodied truths, that the soul escaping the world's corruption was also literal, a flesh and blood person. Perhaps a daughter, perhaps more. The Gospel of Mary never names the revelations she was given. The manuscript breaks. The key passages are missing, torn, eaten by time. But you begin to wonder, did someone remove them? Did someone read what Mary wrote and decide it was too dangerous to let survive? And still, it survived. Through secret copies, through oral traditions, through women who told their daughters stories the world said were blasphemy, through those who believed that a truth passed from mother to child mattered just as much, if not more than one handed down from pulpit to pew. In the quiet defiance of this gospel, you hear the heartbeat of something ancient and relentless, a refusal to vanish. A voice buried beneath centuries of ash and dogma still whispering, "Remember me. I was there. I knew him. He loved me. And I carried more than words." By the time the Black Death rolled through Europe, the name of Jesus had become property owned by bishops, printed in scrolls walled into marble. Yet in the cracks of that cold authority, a different story still flickered. One not preached in cathedrals, but murmured through genealogies scribbled into margins, etched into the emblems of obscure noble houses. A story of a bloodline, divine feminine, exiled and defiantly alive. You might think the theory of Christ's descendants is a modern invention, born of bestsellers and blockbuster thrillers. But long before Dan Brown penned a page, whispers of sacred lineage had already embedded themselves into Europe's collective memory. It didn't start in novels. It started in footnotes. Take the Chronicle of Fredegar, a 7th century Frankish text that describes the Merovingian kings with reverent oddity. They are said to descend from a mystical beast born of sea and man. A myth, sure, but also a shield, perhaps, for something harder to confess. That their origins weren't merely noble, they were sanctified, not by miracle but by maternity. Some believe the sea beast is a metaphor for an outsider bride, someone from the East, bearing a legacy dangerous to claim. A Magdalene, a daughter. By the 12th century, the Grail legends began to spread, interwoven with the lore of King Arthur and secret Christian sects. But in the earliest versions, the Holy Grail wasn't a cup. It was a lineage, a vessel. The womb of a woman who carried something no empire could contain. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach described knights guarding not relics, but the blood. In Wolfram's Parzival, the Grail is not chalice or stone. It is a temple protected by a mysterious brotherhood whose duty is not spiritual conquest, but preservation. In other words, they weren't guarding belief. They were guarding someone. The Templars appear again, here woven into the fabric of bloodline theory. The Dossier Secrets, a mysterious collection of documents deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in the 1960s, make bold, if questionable, claims. That certain French families, Plantard, Saint-Clair, Laurent, descended from a union between Jesus and Magdalene. That these bloodlines were protected by a secret society known as the Priory of Sion. That Ren-le-Chateau held not just gold, but genealogies. Most historians have dismissed these documents as an elaborate hoax, and perhaps they are. But hoaxes require ingredients, old truths, half-forgotten lore, suspicious silences. Fabrication works best when it echoes something people already suspect. And what people suspected for centuries was that something had been erased. In an obscure 14th century English manuscript, a monk named Edric of Glastonbury writes of a red line that passes from the woman at the tomb through many daughters into the House of Kings. He claims to have seen the chart himself, though it was later removed by order from Rome. That phrase, order from Rome, appears in other odd places attached to the disappearance of texts, artifacts, and family trees. You begin to see not just conspiracy, but consistency. In Spanish Catalonia, stone carvings on church columns depict a woman, clearly Magdalene, holding a child. The figure beside her wears a bishop's mitre, but holds no staff, only a scroll with the words, Sanguis meus, my blood. The carving is unsigned. No church records mention its commissioning, but it has never been removed. Then there are the noble houses. Throughout medieval Europe, certain families claimed descent from Davidic lines, code perhaps for something more recent. The de Bouillon family, leaders of the First Crusade, held unusual reverence for Magdalene. The Sinclair clan of Scotland built Rosslyn Chapel, a cathedral thick with esoteric symbols, stars, roses, vines, bees, all linked by some to the sacred feminine. Their tombs are sealed, their archives less accessible. One Renaissance-era genealogical chart from a private archive in Bruges contains an unnamed woman linked to Yeshua Nazarene by a broken line. Next to her, the symbol of a rose entwined with a sword. No date, no explanation. Just the phrase, her name was taken. Her children remained. You could dismiss all this, of course. Say it's coincidence, or art, or fiction. But when fiction refuses to die, when it survives pogroms and plagues, inquisitions and reformations, you begin to wonder what memory it's clinging to. After all, official history rarely remembers the women. But folklore does. Genealogy does. Grandmothers do. The bloodline theory may never be proven, but it never fully disappears either. Because it isn't simply a question of lineage. It's a question of erasure, of who was remembered and who was not, of what was recorded and what was deliberately left blank. And when you gather enough blank spaces, they begin to form a shape, a woman, a womb, and the children history tried to forget. The year is 325 CE. The empire still smells of smoke and blood. Christianity, once outlawed and fed to lions, has become the favored religion of Constantine the Great. And now, in a palace in Nicaea, bishops gather from across the known world not to worship, but to decide. The meeting is about control, not prayer, not piety, power. They called it the First Ecumenical Council. Nearly 300 clerics dressed in wool and gold assembled to settle disputes and define orthodoxy. What is Jesus, human or divine? Which texts are acceptable? Which beliefs are heresy? Behind every question, the pressure of empire. Constantine wanted unity, not truth. He wanted a church that would stabilize his rule, not shake it. And in that room, choices were made. We know that many gospels were excluded. Some were deemed heretical, others simply inconvenient. The Gospel of Mary gone, the Gospel of Philip too strange, the Gospel of Thomas too mystical, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Ebionites, the Nazarenes' texts that might have preserved alternate memories, alternate bloodlines, alternate claims were struck out, not debated, not disproved, silenced. The New Testament, as you know it today, wasn't dropped from heaven. It was voted on. And in the process, the idea of a Christ with a family, of a wife, of daughters, of human ties, was methodically removed from theological possibility. There is no record of a debate over Jesus' marital status. No arguments for or against him having children. It wasn't refuted. It was omitted. Like so many details that didn't serve the new narrative. The divine Son, born of a virgin, crucified, risen, and now enthroned in heaven, tidy, distant, untouchable. A family complicates things. Children carry claims. bloodlines demand recognition. And the early church could not afford that. By affirming apostolic succession, authority passed from Peter, not from any biological heir, the bishops ensured that leadership would flow through their chosen lines, not through women, not through relatives, not through something as messy and inconvenient as a daughter. The Council of Nicaea is remembered for defining the Trinity, but its deeper legacy is erasure. It established not just doctrine but narrative control. The image of Christ became fixed, solitary, celibate, symbolic. His relationships sanitized, his humanity hollowed out. In the wake of the council, persecution shifted from Roman to Christian. Bishops who disagreed with the Nicene Creed were exiled. Texts that told different versions of Jesus' story were burned or buried. One bishop, Arius, insisted that Jesus had once been fully human before becoming divine. He was anathematized, his followers scattered, his writings destroyed. Imagine what would have happened if someone had stood and said, "What of Mary Magdalene? What of the stories told in Gaul? What of the children they never got the chance?" Later, councils reinforced the erasure. At Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, one by one, alternative views were condemned. In 553 CE, the Second Council of Constantinople banned belief in the pre-existence of souls, a direct strike against Gnostic ideas that taught of divine lineage passed through generations. The feminine disappeared from theology. So did the human. And yet the silence is telling. Why suppress what isn't dangerous? If the Church truly believed Jesus had no family, why not say so explicitly? Why not record it, defend it, declare it? They didn't. Because to acknowledge the question was to grant it power. And so a quiet directive emerged. Not in documents, but in action. Certain texts went missing. Certain stories were never translated. Certain figures, James, the brothers and sisters of Jesus, the female disciples, were relegated to the margins. The institutional church became a fortress, its walls built not only of faith, but of forgetting. And outside those walls, in the homes of midwives and the folktales of Provence, in the lit candles before unmarked statues, the older memory lived on. A story of lineage, of wombs that carried wisdom, of children who once bore the breath of something holy. The Council of Nicaea didn't just shape Christian theology. It rewrote a family tree. The Church may have locked the doors and shuttered the windows, but sometimes history seeps in through the cracks from across deserts, through marketplaces along trade routes, where doctrine dissolves into dialogue. If Christ had daughters, if a hidden lineage truly survived, then perhaps it wasn't just Christian memory that preserved it. Perhaps the secret wandered into other faiths, quietly stitched into stories that look at first glance completely unrelated. Take Islam, for instance. In the Quran, Jesus is revered as a prophet, and the Messiah born of the Virgin Mary performing miracles taken up to heaven. He is not crucified according to Islamic tradition. He is not divine. But he is expected to return at the end of days alongside the Mahdi to restore justice. The Quran does not mention children, but Islamic folklore, especially in early Shia mysticism, contains whispers. In several non-canonical hadith and mystic commentaries, there are vague references to a line of prophets through Isa, a phrasing often dismissed as metaphorical. But some Sufi traditions speak of the light of Isa being passed through the pure ones, a phrase sometimes linked to Fatima, daughter of Muhammad, and sometimes to unnamed daughters of other prophets. A few fringe sects have even claimed that secret bloodlines trace back not only to Muhammad, but to Isa, merged through spiritual marriage, forming a double helix of holy descent. And then there are the Mandaeans. an ancient Gnostic-adjacent community still surviving in pockets of southern Iraq and Iran. The Mandaeans revere John the Baptist as their primary prophet and regard Jesus with deep caution. They believe he distorted the teachings of earlier masters, and yet their writings, particularly the Ginza Rabbah, contain odd references to the hidden one born of a teacher and a woman of light. This figure is unnamed, genderless, in some translations distinctly feminine in others. Could this be a fragment of a memory, a second-hand echo of a forbidden tradition? In Ethiopia, among the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jews, who maintained ancient semi-independent scriptural traditions, some oral histories claim that after the crucifixion, followers of Jesus fled south, bringing with them relics and a sacred name carried in the arms of a woman. In some versions, this is Mary Magdalene. In others, it is her daughter. The story is obscure, woven into lullabies and funeral chants, not written in any codex, but there nonetheless. Meanwhile, in the remote Druze communities of Lebanon and northern Israel, whose religious doctrine is closed to outsiders, esoteric texts speak of al-Aqul, the feminine aspect of divine wisdom born into human form when the world needs healing. She is said to be descended from an unknown prophet. Her identity is never named, but in one poem she is called Daughter of the Light Who Walked Across Water. Coincidence, perhaps. But then you consider how stories travel, how they survive not in cathedrals but in kitchens. You consider the persistent theme of a feminine vessel, a hidden heir, a secret kept from the powerful, but passed along by the forgotten. Not grand proclamations, but whispers. Not records, but rumors. In Armenia, legends persist of a black-veiled woman who came from the west fleeing war. She brought a child. Her name has been lost, but her story remains in village songs where she is called the woman who carried God's voice in her blood. Even in Hindu texts, particularly among fringe interpretations of Shakti traditions, some mystics draw parallels between the descent of divine knowledge and the birth of the child who remembers heaven. In esoteric interpretations, this is not myth. It's lineage. You start to see a mosaic forming, each faith with its own tile, none complete, but all pointing toward something long obscured. And perhaps that's the point. The truth, if it ever lived, did not cling to one creed. It moved with the people who remembered. It adapted, wore new names, new metaphors. It survived not because it was enshrined in gold, but because it was carried, in stories, in symbols, in daughters. Maybe the church believed it had locked the secret away forever. But secrets like seeds don't die in darkness. They wait. You've followed parchments and paintings, whispers and wounds. Now you arrive at the modern age where legends are tested not by scripture or scandal, but by science. In a world of genome maps and ancestry tests, can a bloodline once erased be traced again? Could there be scattered across Europe or further still, people living ordinary lives who unknowingly carry an extraordinary inheritance? The question feels absurd until it doesn't. You start with surnames. In regions of southern France, especially in the areas tied to Magdalene legends and Cathar ruins, certain last names appear with curious consistency. Names like Saracen Madeleine or Desposin. Some are passed off as coincidence, others as derivations. But when traced through genealogical records, you find strange convergences. Families with unbroken lines back to the 9th century. Families whose oral histories speak of ancestors who fled from Jerusalem, carried relics, or were guardians of the hidden name. Then there's the DNA. In 2006, a quiet paper emerged from a French research team studying mitochondrial DNA patterns in the Languedoc. Nothing conclusive. But they noted a small population cluster exhibiting genetic markers uncommon to the surrounding regions, closer in profile to Near Eastern lines. The sample size was too small. The results were largely ignored. But the question remained, what if a family had fled Judea in the 1st century, settled in Gaul, and remained largely isolated for generations? Would their DNA still hum with difference? Elsewhere in rural Brittany and parts of Catalonia, small communities with legends of the Magdalene child have participated in genealogical tracing projects. Again, no smoking gun. But patterns emerged, haplogroups linked to ancient Levantine origins disproportionately frequent in women. Of course, science demands caution. These regions were part of Roman trade routes. Genetic mixing was inevitable. But then you hear the stories. Families who tell their daughters they come from a line of light. Women whose grandmothers swore there was something in the blood. Men who have dreams of a red-robed woman holding a child whose face they somehow know. None of this appears in test results, but it lingers. There's the story of the Lauron family in southern France, keepers of a small chapel no longer listed on diocesan maps. Inside a single statue of Mary Magdalene holding a scroll in one hand and a young girl's hand in the other. Local records show the family has maintained the chapel for over 400 years. When asked why the current caretaker, a farmer in his 70s, simply says, "It's ours to protect." Then there's the tale of the Gallego sisters in northern Spain, who carry family records dating back to the 12th century. Among them, a page with a crude drawing, a chalice, a rose, and beneath it, the word sangria. Not the drink. The blood. Some scholars dismiss all this as wishful thinking, the human need for mystery. But then you hear of the project quietly conducted by a group of independent researchers in the 1990s, collecting DNA samples from individuals in southern France, whose families had lived in the same valleys for generations. The results were never published. The team disbanded. Rumors claim the data showed patterns no one wanted to explain. And what of the Vatican? They possess hundreds of relics, bones, teeth, hair attributed to saints, apostles, even the Holy Family. But none have ever been subjected to third-party genetic analysis. When asked, church officials cite sanctity, tradition, and respect for the dead. Understandable, convenient. Yet one wonders if they had nothing to hide. Why protect it so fiercely? Perhaps the most compelling evidence isn't found in genes, but in memory. Folk memory. In parts of Provence, elderly women still place red roses at unmarked shrines and call them for the mother. When asked who she is, they shrug and say, "She came from across the sea. She brought something with her." No one remembers what exactly, only that it mattered. Folk memory is notoriously stubborn. It survives conquest, conversion, and time. It clings to lullabies, blessings, the way a daughter's name is whispered 3 times before sleep. If a bloodline exists, if the daughters of Christ walked among us, would we even recognize them? They would not wear crowns. They would not boast. They would not know. But perhaps their dreams would be strange. Perhaps their silence would be deep. And perhaps every now and then they would feel the weight of something ancient moving through their veins. Something unrecorded, but very much alive. A spark, a name, a memory no one taught them. Yet somehow they've always known. You've followed ghost trails through catacombs, parchments, frescoes, and the hush between lines. Now you stand at the edge of the present, looking back not for fantasy, but for a pattern, a convergence, a final reckoning of clues that no longer whisper but harmonize. And you begin to realize the secret, if it ever existed, was never fully buried. It was scattered, hidden in plain sight. The church was meticulous, yes, but never perfect. They erased names, not lineages, They censored texts, not memories. And throughout Europe, small contradictions remain like stubborn weeds pushing through stone. Magdalene portrayed with a child in medieval stained glass. Hidden records in diocesan back rooms. Templars who vanished into noble houses under assumed names. And families who swear by blood, not scripture. The descendants, if they exist, would not be draped in mystery cloaks or followed by secret societies. They would be ordinary. Teachers, nurses, engineers. They would not know. Or rather, they might suspect in quiet moments when the world softens and an ancestral gravity tugs at the edge of waking. You remember that scene from earlier, the French farmer guarding a forgotten chapel? The woman who dreams of red-robed mothers. You start to see them not as isolated stories, but as echoes, a pattern. Incomplete, yes, but unmistakable. Then you reconsider the Church's reaction, their fury toward Gnostic texts, their relentless discrediting of Mary Magdalene, their obsession with celibacy, not just for priests, but for Christ. If it was only theological, the vehemence seems excessive. But if there were something more, a lineage, a feminine inheritance, they would have had motive. To protect doctrine, to protect power, to prevent any claim that could destabilize a hierarchy centuries in the making. Of course, the modern world scoffs. These stories are often treated as fringe theories, romantic fables spun for bored academics or thriller novelists. But the evidence doesn't fade. It mutates. It reemerges. In basilica carvings, in apocryphal scrolls, in surnames clinging to old provinces like ivy. And when you gather all the fragments from the suppressed Gospels to whispered village tales, a shape begins to form. Not proof, but a possibility so profound it demands consideration. A daughter, then another, then many. Living, loving, bearing children of their own. Line after line, century after century. No claims to royalty, no ambitions for the throne, just people. Hidden not by conspiracies, but by life itself. War, plague, marriage, anonymity. Until their names became just names, and the truth became just a story. Told in candlelight, remembered in dreams. And yet if you followed this far, something still stirs. Because the idea is not just plausible, it is oddly comforting. That Christ the man might have known the joys and pains of fatherhood. That his teachings continued not just in letters but in laughter, in lullabies. And if somewhere out there his blood still pulses quietly in a woman reading bedtime stories to her daughter, then the line was not broken, only hidden, erased from history, but never lost. And now, with every thread unspooled and every candle flickering low, you settle into the silence between certainties. This has never been a tale about proof. Not really. It was always about possibility and the weight of what might have been. The image of Christ, solitary, glowing, unreachable, was painted by institutions. But the possibility of him laughing with a daughter, tracing her curls with tired fingers, whispering parables not to crowds, but to a child he loved. It lingers. A softer legacy. One that breathes. Perhaps the bloodline is literal. Perhaps names were changed, memories, guarded secrets passed like heirlooms. Or perhaps it was something more symbolic. A spiritual inheritance. A sacred feminine energy meant to complement, not challenge, the masculine. Maybe the daughters were never just children. Maybe they were ideas, truths, or voices of women who refused to vanish even when history tried to forget them. You exhale slowly. The pace drifts. The story folds in on itself like parchment sealed and slipped into a forgotten drawer. All that remains now is quiet, and the sense that something precious once lived just out of view, and still might. Sleep comes gently, with no answers, only echoes. And somewhere beneath the surface of time, a bloodline, real or imagined, waits to be remembered.